right, well, good morning. I'll have you know I was just right outside, trying not to disturb any. I had to run out and grab some water because I was hacking up a lung because it's like flu season. Anyone else affected by flu season here? Anybody else been sick or gotten this awful virus? Yeah, not fun. My kids were home sick this week. Not fun. You know, the worst part about having sick kids, I found as a parent, is that trying to get them to take their medicine, they turn into such whiny babies. It's like, oh, I don't want to take it. It tastes bad. And mom says Jack Daniels isn't real medicine. It's like, oh, just take it. Anyway, we are going to be looking at some strong medicine today in the scriptures. Jesus has some strong medicine, and it does not taste good. And it's not just for some people in the room. Unfortunately, this medicine is for everyone, including me. And so even in preparation for this sermon, I realized just how many symptoms I had and what this medicine was. So this is just really going to be an unfun sermon, just like a sledgehammer to the face. Let's go. All right. It's in Luke 18, if you can turn there. It's also in your notes. I'm going to read from my Bible. It's Luke 18, starting in verse 9. This is Jesus talking about some stuff. It says, to some who were confident in their own righteousness and looked down on everybody else, Jesus told this parable, this story. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, that's like a religious person, religious leader, and the other a tax collector, which is like terrible. The Pharisee stood up and prayed about himself. God, I thank you that I am not like other men, robbers and evildoers and adulterers, or even like this tax collector here. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all that I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And then Jesus says, I tell you this, that this man rather than the other went home justified before God. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. I'm going to hone in on that final warning from Jesus, and it's a warning, not a threat, a warning. Threats are made out of power and the need for power. Warnings are made out of care. They're parents trying to tell their children, don't do that, ten cuidado, watch out. And here's the warning from Jesus. Everyone who exalts himself will be humbled. If you humble yourself, you'll be exalted. So you got two options, really. You can humble yourself or be humiliated. Those are our options, apparently. Everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Or, these are the words of Jesus, or in the words of, kind of modern words of a modern prophet, Ice Cube, you better check yourself before you wreck yourself. I got it in there. That was just for me. So what are we talking about here? We are talking about, and we have been going through the 7 deadly sins over the past few weeks. We're talking here about what C.S. Lewis actually calls the center of Christian morality. I don't know what the center is, Lewis says. Some people think it's sexuality or sexual morals or good behavior. He says this is actually the center. The center of Christian morality is this singular word, and it's the word pride. Pride, the opposite of humility. Now, pride often, when I hear the word pride, and this is the weird semantic thing, we all have words and we all have language around the words. I think of arrogance, don't you? When you think of pride, I think of arrogance, right? Somebody who thinks too highly of themselves. And of course, this is an excellent definition of pride, and it's biblical. I don't think it's fully complete. We'll talk about that in just a second. But the biblical definition of pride certainly includes thinking too highly of yourself. In fact, in the Old Testament, as I was kind of studying this, I kind of saw a pattern again and again and again. God goes after the leaders of nations and of Israel and says, it's actually your pride, your unwillingness to actually see yourself correctly for who you are, and the right relationship, especially in the right relationship between me and you. Oftentimes in the Old Testament, leaders were condemned by God and actually chastised by God. Prophets were sent to them to say, listen, you think too highly of yourself. You think you're God. Or you worship not Yahweh, you worship another God. It kind of goes like this. There's a king in the middle, and the king is over all the people, and the people are under him. But then the king actually begins to worship some false god, some other deity. And as a result, it brings ruin upon the people, and the people suffer because of the poor decisions and the idolatry of the king and his refusal to worship Yahweh. He puts himself on too high of a plane. He views himself too highly. Most famously, one of the most famous examples of this, and if we had time, we could do a whole sermon on this, is a guy named Nebuchadnezzar. One of the most fascinating stories in all of the Old Testament. There's this moment where he has this dream. He's like, hey, who can interpret this dream? This guy Daniel comes in, and basically this is what he has this dream that he's going to get humbled because he has too high a view of himself. And Daniel actually turns white and is just like, man, this dream is bad. You think too highly of yourself, and it's going to be bad. God's going to actually humble you until you realize that you're not God, that even though you're one of the most powerful men in the entire planet. In fact, a lot of historians and commentators say Nebuchadnezzar is one of the 6 or 7 greatest, wealthiest, most powerful men in the history of humanity. So he's got it going on. And in the middle of this, look what he says. This is Nebuchadnezzar. He's out there, he builds Babylon in the middle of this empire. It's this gorgeous city. Many people say it's one of the most fantastic cities ever built. And he looks and look what he says. Is this not the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty? And as you read this, what do? You're like, ooh. You can see it, right? You can see the lack of pride. You can see the arrogance. You can see the idolatry of himself, of these other gods, these Babylonian gods. And so it's like, and so Yahweh comes down with the hammer. He comes down with the hammer. And it's not because his pride has been God's pride or God's ego has been damaged. It is because it is disastrous for a human being to live this way. And God loves us too much to allow us to remain in this state of non-reality. We live in the state of non-reality a bunch, don't we? It's a default setting of humans. And it's hard. And so this is what Yahweh says. Oh, Nebuchadnezzar, you will be driven away from the people and will live with the wild animals. You think you're higher than all men? I'm going to show you that you're actually nothing more than a beast. And you actually, by behaving this way, have turned yourself subhuman. And so you will eat the grass like it. The ox 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. Who's in charge here? Yahweh, the Creator God. Yahweh is in charge here, and he says, Nebuchadnezzar, until you learn this lesson, I will not let this go. I will not let this pass. This is just good parenting, isn't it? You ever had a kid? I've got teenagers now, right? And so we're in the middle of this. This is fun. And without their permission, I'm going to share a story just because it makes me look good. Here it is. I'm kidding. I'm not. So the other day, my son leaves, and he's like, all right, I'm going out. I'm like, all right, how are you getting home? Is somebody going to drive you home? Do you want me to come get you? He's like, oh, somebody will drive me home. I'm like, what time? And he's like, well, I'll tell you later what time I'm going to get home. And my wife, his mom, is just like, that is not how this works. And she just does the whole, and so anyway, what is he trying to say there, right? Like, who makes the rules? I do. And his mother's like, that is not how this works. And I was like, yeah. She's right. So idolatry and pride kind of go together. And at the very least, it's thinking of yourself too highly. That's at the bare minimum of what the definition of pride is. C.S. Lewis puts it this way, and we hate this, man, we really do. You ever met somebody who's super arrogant? They're really hard to be friends with, aren't they? They're really hard to be around. Ever met someone who's never wrong? Hey, don't look at me like, wow, I'm working on it. You know what I'm talking about, right? This is rough. This is rough. You ever met somebody who never listens? You ever met somebody who never admits fault even when they have clearly hurt somebody else? These people are hard to be around. Lewis puts it this way. There's one vice, and this is in his book, Mere Christianity, in which he calls pride the center of Christian morality. There is one vice of which no man in the world is free, which everyone in the world loathes when he sees it in someone else, and of which hardly any people except Christians ever imagine they are ever guilty of themselves. There is no fault which makes a man more unpopular, no fault which we are more unconscious of in ourselves. And the more we have it in ourselves, the more we dislike it in others. And I say to that man, I hate arrogance. That was a joke. Okay, moving. Do you know this, right? When you see this. Lewis says no people except for Christians actually can see this. Let's talk about why that is. But before we go any further, I want to say that pride, biblically speaking, is not just thinking too highly of yourself, although that is absolutely in the definition. That's an Old Testament definition. That was going on with Nebuchadnezzar. That's what God can't stand. It's making their own rules. But it goes... Because here's the problem. I'm not like Nebuchadnezzar. I don't have a giant kingdom, and I'm not a king, and I don't have a giant empire. And so if I don't have those things, you know what I start to do to myself? I'm like, well, I'm not arrogant like him. And so what do? I let myself off the hook. Do you see? I think a more robust biblical definition that includes even more, which is even more stinging, is not just thinking of yourself too highly. I would submit it's thinking of oneself too much and not thinking about God very much at all. You see the difference? It's not just thinking of yourself too highly, it's thinking of yourself too much. Having your thoughts and your life centered on yourself and not centered on God very much at all. That doesn't let any of us in this room off the hook, does it? Because this is our predilection, this is our bent, this is where we go. This is how we live. We are de facto selfish. So here's the thing. My buddy he struggles with arrogance. He thinks he's awesome. So when he walks into a room, he thinks to himself, I can't wait for people to meet me. They're going to love me. I'm going to be funny. It's going to be great. All right? So a little bit too arrogant, right? Instead of going into the room, who's he focusing on? Himself, right? Now his wife, because God does this, is opposite. So she walks into a room and she's like, they're all going to hate me. No one here is going to want to talk to me. Where are her thoughts? Herself. So in a weird way, too much self-esteem and no self-esteem have the same net root, which is self-preoccupation, which allows people who have low self-esteem to say, well, I'm not prideful. Well, according to this definition, according to, I think, a more full biblical definition, you are. Because you're thinking of yourself too much. Now, this stings for me and for you. This stings for everybody. So let's just not pretend just because I'm about 3 feet above you right now that I don't need to drink this medicine all the time. The medicine of humility. So let's talk about this for a second. This is not just our bent as humans because of the fall. We'll talk about that in a second. This is actually the way our entire culture goes. Our entire culture's cultural current runs this way. Now, I'm very indebted to this cultural analysis by a guy named Mark Sayre, who is a thoughtful theologian from New Zealand, which is a great place to be from. Lord of the Rings was filmed there. That's all I know about it. Anyway, he actually says our culture is deeply religious. He says we actually share, because we're so deeply Christian in our roots, we actually have a narrative. We have a story. We have a story about that runs the same way that the Bible story goes. It's just very, very different components. So here's the story. The story starts up here, and we can go through this. This is the story. And the story has an Eden, and it has a fall, and it has salvation, it has holiness, it has discipleship, and it even has a vision of heaven. And so our culture has the same components of the Christian narrative, of the Christian story. The only difference is that it's not Christian at all. In fact, it's quite different. And I want to show you this, and this is what Sayers says. In our culture, the Eden in our culture is the true self, the unspoiled inner child. We were born and everything was great, and then we had everything going on, and then culture and our environments and the corruption of this world began exerting its influence on us, and that's why we are corrupted. But Eden is actually the unspoiled true self, your truest self. Now, in the biblical story, Eden is humans walking with the very presence of God in a good world that he has created for us, carved out. Now, the fall in our cultural narrative is trauma, loss of innocence, bad things that have happened to us. And in the fall, in the biblical story, is rebellion against the loving rule of God. It's setting ourselves up as the purveyors of what's right and what's wrong, and that is on us. Salvation in our modern culture, the cultural narrative that we live in, is to find yourself. Be true to yourself. Figure out what you want. Salvation, of course, and this is a reductionistic statement in the Bible, is being rescued by God, because we can't do it ourselves, into loving relationship with God through the work and the person of Jesus Christ. That's what salvation is. We need rescued. So Jesus comes through the will of the Father to come rescue us. But it goes even further. Holiness in our cultural narrative is freedom from all external constraints. I just want to be free. Eat, pray, love. This is this idea. Just find out what makes you happy and be free from anything that would take away your happiness. Any constraint. That's what Freud's definition of freedom is. Freedom from any constraints. Holiness in the biblical narrative is quite different. It's not freedom from restraints, it's submitting to the right constraints. In this case, relationship with God through Jesus. And you have got to become like him. And then discipleship. Discipleship in our modern narrative is pursue what makes you happy. Whatever it is that makes you happy, you have to pursue that with all diligence. Go after it. Girl, wash your face. Go after it. Just go, get it, grab it, go after it. If it makes you happy, do whatever it takes to grab it, and don't stop, because we're Silicon Valley and boom, boom. Discipleship in the Bible, again, this is reductionistic, but try to be precise here, is practicing the way of Jesus with the power of the Spirit, becoming like Jesus. That's what it is. And then, of course, heaven. Heaven, in our modern narrative, is pleasure, which, by the way, is very different than joy. Pleasure is incredibly temporary, and it just does not last. Pleasure and happiness, and I use happiness in the vaguest, most reductionistic sense of the word, fleeting happiness, not like deep joy. And it's pleasure and happiness without restraint. Heaven, of course, in the biblical picture, is Jesus as King and the new creation with God the Father reigning in the new heavens and the new earth, and we are there. All of us, united with God through Christ as he reigns. And he remakes this world and gets rid of sin and death and all those invaders. Now, here's the problem. Our culture is really, really, really good at selling that narrative. It's really good at it. And it's everywhere. It's everywhere. I have kids. I got a 14-year-old, almost 15. I got a 12-year-old. This narrative is everywhere. It invades everything. Death to self. Don't follow your desires. This is foreign language. The biblical story is foreign language. But did you notice in that graph, where is the center of the narrative in our modern culture? It's completely self-focused, isn't it? It's completely self-focused. And so, because all of our culture screams this, where do we drift? To ourselves. Do you see? And this is not just our culture, by the way. It goes even deeper than that. In fact, it goes even further back than that. This is not something that just 21st century Americans have to deal with. I want to show you as quickly as I can how the story of self-focus actually begins on about the 3rd page of the Bible. Humans are created, everything's good, and then it's not. There's an invader. The snake comes in and begins talking and sets forth an idea. We're going to go through this real quick. Satan actually comes in. I want to show you something, and this is fascinating to me. Linguistically, and again, we believe at Westgate the Bible's actually the words of God, which means it's actually this incredible work of staggering genius and incredible literary genius. And so even in the pages of Genesis 3, as we look at it, I'm gonna highlight some words. The words that are there, I'm gonna highlight them in this kind of gold. Those are words about God, about Yahweh, about his rule. And then the other words that are human-focused are in purple. So Satan comes in and says, did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? So if you look at this, Satan introduces this idea. Did God really say this, or are you free to do this? So it's kind of a 50-50, right? The linguistically what's going on in terms of this is there's one word that's human focused, and one word that's Yahweh focused. And then it goes on, and Eve responds, well, we may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say you must not eat the fruit from the tree that's in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it or you will die. Now all of a sudden, you see where she's shifting? She's focusing not on what God said, but on her. And then Satan comes back and says, oh, you will not certainly die. God knows that you will eat it, and your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. All of a sudden, Satan shifts the balance. And linguistically, as we look at this, the balance of where the emphasis is strictly on the humans. And then Eve, when the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some, she ate it, she gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Now you see, where's God? Gone. The humans have gone from excising God from their thoughts, and he's gone from the text. He's not even in it. This is what we do. So it's not just our culture that's in trouble here. It goes much, 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 much further and much deeper than this. In fact, you could say that a prideful person's thoughts, this is a graph that I've made. There they are. It's an effective diagram. Let me give you one more example, and then we got to get going. You're like, well, somebody who is insecure can't possibly have pride, right? This is the definition of pride, as arrogance. I'm going to show you early on in the story, again in Exodus, there's this guy named Moses. And there's this moment where God comes to Moses with this grand idea. And I want to show you something that happens in the narrative. Again, the literary genius. Yahweh comes on the scene, God, and he says this, and I've highlighted everything that's about God. I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now I am sending you, Moses, to go to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Now, who's the center of this grand speech? Yahweh. My people, I came down, I'm sending you, they're mine, I'm going to get them out, I'm going to rescue, right? Who's the center focus, right? It's God, it's Yahweh. Now, immediately after this, Moses has 5 retorts to Yahweh in a row. First, he says this, but Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Okay, where's his focus in this sentence? Who am I? And Yahweh's like, I'll be with you. Don't worry about it. I'll be with you, and so it'll be great. Response 2, Moses continues. Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me, and they ask me, what's his name? What am I even going to tell them? And God's like, tell them Yahweh, that's my name. Just go. That's what you're worried about? My name? What they're going to say? Fine. Yahweh's my name. Let's go. Again, where's Moses' focus? All right, 3. Moses answered, what if they don't believe me or listen to me? And what if they say the Lord didn't appear to you? And then God's like, I'll make some staffs turn into snakes, all right? Don't worry. And then response 4, pardon your servant, Lord, I've never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you've spoken to me. I'm slow of speech and tongue. And God's like, I will help you talk good. And then finally, response 5, pardon your servant, Lord, please send someone else. All right, now, honestly though, we give Moses a lot of credit, but where is all of his focus? There's the graph. And I want to show you what happens right after this. Right after he says that, then the Lord's anger burned against Moses. Of course it did. He's like, I have an oppressed people to save. And you're wondering what they're going to think of you? Get going. I'm paraphrasing. Do you see how frustrating that must have been to Yahweh? I have thousands of people, children and women and slaves who've been oppressed for 400 years, and all you can think about is how they're going to receive you in the courts of Pharaoh? Would you get your eyes off yourself and get them onto what I'm trying to do here? It's a big deal. Luckily, the Lord is not me, because I would not be that patient. He's very, very patient. But he's very insistent that pride can have no place in our priorities. So, how does this look in us? Here's a list of things that as I examine my own life, these are the things I'm comfortable sharing with you from stage. Social climbing. Social climbing exists everywhere, and it's where you have a priority or a hierarchy of people that you will interact with because of what they will give to you, how it makes you feel. There's some people who are more valuable than others according to our society, and so you hang out with those people. It's like the stock market of relationships. I'm only going to invest in companies going up. And this happens everywhere. It means ignoring people who are on the outside, who are different than you. Social climbing. This happens all the time. Judging others. I'm awesome at this. Seriously, I'm really, really good. I can see exactly where you're going wrong and how dumb you are and what's wrong with your life, and I've got a wonderful plan to fix it if you just listen to me. Of course, I don't bother listening to your story or your life. I don't bother paying attention to all the things that have happened. I just know exactly why you're broken. And I can just dismiss you as wrong. I do this really well. This is arrogance. This is pride. It's not serving the people. What's in it for me? Well, I'll do it, but I want to make sure I get something out of it. God often asks us to do things that have no external value. He just asks us to do it because he wants it done. And sometimes it costs us. Jesus didn't say, everyone who wants to live, come follow me and I'll make your life awesome. He says, take up your cross, deny yourself, and then follow me. But I want to do this thing. I've got a desire. I really like this thing. I really like to do this. I really want to do it. As you know, since September, I've been working with the high school at the Saratoga campus. We're without a high school minister right now, so I stepped in. I've been doing that. My kids are actually in that ministry, so it's easy for me to step in. It's easy for me to go alongside the other leaders who have been doing it for so long and care for these high schoolers, and I see this all the time. One of the things, and this is going to sound strange, so I'm just going to speak anonymously, I have all these high school boys, and again and again and again, the thing that comes up in our discipleship is they talk about pornography, and they talk about masturbation, and they say all these things. They say, I know that I shouldn't do this, and I know that I am giving in to my desires, but what's happening, I can feel it. I can feel myself turning inward. I can feel it warping me. I can feel it hurting me. I can feel it ripping me away from Jesus because it's all about me. In their sexual formation, they are already keenly aware that these things, these influences, are curving them inward, away from God, away from service, away from others, and into themselves. And they say, I want to do this thing. And some of them argue, and they're like, well, it's not fair, whatever, who cares? God gave us these desires, so just go after them, It's not even fair that God did that. To which Jesus says, just because you want to do a thing doesn't mean you should. And sometimes our desires can lie to us and lead us to ruin and even lead us to destroy the people we say we love the most. Desire is not to be followed, but submitted. Decision making. How do you make decisions? Is God even in the process? Sometimes I say to God, okay, God, here's what I'd like. If you could just sign off, that'd be great. You ever do that? Be nice to be more prayerful. Unwillingness to be treated like a servant. This is a huge one for me. My wife went to this conference this weekend, and I had to be responsible for the children. When she came home, I wanted a gold star. I did it! 3 whole hours! I am a king among men. Where's my dad badge? I earned it. That didn't go well. I don't like being treated like a servant. I don't. I want to be seen and valued. And look, part of that's like real. If you do something for somebody else, you really want them to express that. I get it. But I don't even want to do that stuff. But that's not how life works. Anxiety and worry, when this crushes me and fills me with worry and fear, I really think that this is a self-focus, because my focus is on the world and me. And you know where my focus never is in worry? You know who's never in the story when I worry? You know who's not even there? God. The Spirit. Jesus. Not even there. In my imagination, it's always the worst case scenario, and God's always never anywhere near. I'm all alone. And then lastly, building my own kingdom. We do this in the Bay Area a lot. Okay, so how do we get out of this? What's the antidote? Man, I wish I could give you one easy step to getting rid of pride in your life and have you go home and then boom, it'd be fixed. There was some sort of pill we could develop. There's not. What I do know is that Jesus encourages us to practice self-denial daily. And somehow, by practicing, we get a little better. Become a little bit more like Jesus. We set up trellises to help our lives grow like grapevines toward the way of Jesus, which is humility. I wish I had an easy, do this, and this, it'll all go away. Even as I've been reflecting, this is deep work that God wants to do in all of us. I'm an only child, so imagine how fun it is to be married to an only child. Yeah, some of you are laughing. Only children are like, everyone existed for me. I'm an only child. Sharing? What's that? Huh? It's all for me. This whole house is for me. Dinner for me. Christmas, all the presents for me. Grandparents, they all exist for me. Not easy to overcome. So let's go and talk about Philippians 2. This is Paul's I don't know. I think this is one of actually the most beautiful, astonishing passages in all of Scripture. Let's reflect on this. And let's do some work with God. Do nothing, Paul says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. This is the pride, the selfishness. Rather, in humility, Paul says, value others more than you value yourself. Don't look to your own interests only, but look to the interests of others. Oh, easy for you to say, and then Paul's like, oh, I know this is impossible. So I'm not just going to tell you to do something with empty moralizing and willpower. I'm going to show you how to get there. And then he gives us this example. Consider, in all your relationships, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. And then Paul flips and begins to talk about Jesus, who, being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he emptied himself. He made himself nothing. He took the very nature of a servant, slave. Being made in human likeness and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself, even became obedient to death on a cross. This is who we follow. This is Christ. And if that's what the King does, and his will deserves to be done, then it means that you and I have to go after this model. This is what Jesus does. If anyone deserved to have their will done, it's Jesus. Yet, look what he did. He emptied all of that privilege, gave it all up. All of the godness, all the benefits, laid it down, emptied himself. And didn't just empty that out. He came down and became obedient to whatever his Father wanted, this rescue mission for us. And he became obedient even to death. And not just any normal death. Death on a cross. This is who we serve. This is who we should focus on. This is what we're to become. So how do we do this? In just a minute, I'm going to ask you just to do some work with God. There's this moment. Do you remember that moment in the final parts of Jesus' life? He's in the upper room. It's his last meal with his disciples. Do you remember this moment? And Jesus is there, and he could do or say anything. And you know what Jesus does? He gets a basin and a towel, and he says, I'm going to wash your feet, guys. And Peter recoils. This is not the work for a Messiah. He says, I'm not going to have you do that. It's humiliating. That's the work for servants. And Jesus is like, exactly. This is an astonishing moment in human history. But think about that for a second. For any king to wash anyone's feet is absurd. For the Messiah, the Son of God, God himself, to come down and do that is just, it's just staggering. I had this thing, I set a reminder on my phone and it dings. Every hour. And when that happens, I say to myself, take the towel. And I think around me, who's around me that needs help? My thoughts go to my kids, my wife, my friends. I pray, sometimes taking the towel is just praying for my friends who I know really need God's help right now. They're in some tough situations. Sometimes it's more serious, like, hey, clean those dishes, Dave. Because taking the towel means serving those that you love. It means serving the people around you. I have to be reminded of this, like, hourly. That's how strong my drift is to myself. Some of you are probably better at that, but would you pray with me? And just in a spirit of humility, if you feel comfortable, if you could just put your hands out in front of you as a way of saying, God, here it is. If you're comfortable, if that's your prayer, if that's what you want. This is a symbol of submission. It's a symbol that God is king, not me. that it's his will that deserves to be done, not mine, that I'm broken, that I need help, that I'm prone to wander, and I need help. But I want my life to look like his. Would you ask God for help? I'd like us to close with the words of Jesus as he taught us to pray. And as we say these words together, some of you might know these and they're deep in your heart. Just look, listen to where Jesus tells us to focus our hearts and minds. You say it with me. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, for thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. This is the opposite of pride. It's focusing our hearts on God. Would you stand with me as we sing?